Before we begin tonight's story, I want to thank Ryan McPherson for suggesting this fascinating topic. The Kecksburg incident has captivated researchers for decades, and tonight we explore it through the eyes of someone who was actually there. If you have story suggestions, please leave them in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe to Sleep Theories if you enjoy these deep dives into mysterious events. December the 9th, 1965. The date still sends a chill through my bones 40 years later. Most people remember where they were when Kennedy was shot, or when man first walked on the moon. Me? I remember exactly where I was standing when that fireball tore across the Pennsylvania sky and changed everything I thought I knew about the world we live in. My name is Tom Brennan, and I was a field technician for Bell Telephone Long Lines, stationed out of Greensburg, Pennsylvania. My call sign was KN3WBR, and I'd been working the microwave relay towers that carried America's long-distance calls across the backbone of our communications network. It was Cold War work, though we didn't always think of it that way. Every conversation, every military communication, every government hotline, it all passed through systems like the ones I maintained. The long lines network was something most civilians never thought about, but it was the nervous system of the entire country. We had microwave towers stretching from coast to coast, carrying voice traffic, teletype communications and data streams that kept America running. During the Cuban Missile Crisis 3 years earlier, every word between Washington and Moscow had likely passed through equipment I'd personally calibrated and maintained. It was responsibility that weighed on you, even when you tried not to think about it. That Thursday afternoon, I was up on Chestnut Ridge, working on the microwave site that overlooked the rolling hills of Westmoreland County. The December air was crisp and clear, perfect conditions for long-range propagation. I'd just finished aligning a dish antenna that carried traffic between Pittsburgh and Harrisburg when I saw it, a brilliant streak of fire racing across the western sky, moving from northwest to southeast with a speed that made my trained eye immediately discount any aircraft. The thing was massive, burning white hot with a tail that stretched across maybe 30 degrees of sky. But what struck me as odd, even in that first moment, was how controlled it looked. I'd seen meteors before, plenty of them during my late-night tower climbs. This wasn't the chaotic tumble of space rock hitting atmosphere. This thing was oriented, nose forward, trailing what looked almost like rocket exhaust. The trajectory was too steady, too purposeful for natural debris. I grabbed my binoculars from the truck and tracked the object as it continued southeast. Through the lenses, I could make out what looked like a definite shape, not the irregular chunk you'd expect from a meteorite, but something with clean lines and a purposeful design. It was maintaining attitude, flying like a vehicle rather than falling like debris. I was still watching when my monitoring equipment started acting up. The westbound long lines hop, the one carrying traffic from Chicago to Philadelphia, showed a sudden 2 to 3 decibel fade right as the fireball passed overhead. That was unusual. Atmospheric events didn't typically affect microwave propagation unless they involved significant ionization. Simultaneously, a cluster of dial switches at the Latrobe Exchange dropped into holdover mode, a protective state they only entered during serious system anomalies or electromagnetic interference. The timing wasn't coincidental. Whatever that object was, it was putting out enough electromagnetic energy to disrupt solid-state communications equipment across a wide area. That suggested either exotic propulsion or significant electrical systems still operating during what should have been a catastrophic re-entry. Then KDKA broke into their regular programming. "We're receiving reports of a brilliant fireball seen across western Pennsylvania and eastern Ohio," the announcer said, his voice carrying that professional tension of breaking news. The object was visible for several minutes and appeared to impact somewhere in the wooded hills southeast of Pittsburgh. "We're dispatching news teams to investigate. If you witnessed this event, please call our newsroom." I checked my watch. 4:47 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I made a note in my logbook. Standard procedure for any unusual events that might affect network operations. Little did I know that notation would become one of the most important entries I'd ever make. My field radio crackled to life 20 minutes later. It was dispatch sending me to check a cutover hut near Kecksburg after locals reported something in the woods that might have damaged our equipment. The cut-over hut housed switching equipment for several rural telephone exchanges, and any damage there could isolate entire communities from the outside world. "Brennan, we're getting reports of power fluctuations and equipment failures in the Kecksburg area," the dispatcher said. "Could be related to that meteor everyone's talking about. I need you to check the remote terminal and make sure our lines are still operational. Standard procedure. When weird things happen, check the phone lines first." Communications infrastructure was critical enough that we investigated any potential threat, no matter how unlikely it seemed. I loaded my gear into the company truck. Test equipment, spare components, toolkit, emergency repair supplies, and my camera for documenting any damage. The drive to Kecksburg would take about 40 minutes through winding country roads that followed the ridgelines and valleys of southwestern Pennsylvania. I drove through the gathering dusk, past farms and small communities that most people pass through without noticing. The radio chatter was picking up. State police dispatchers coordinating response to multiple calls about the fireball, fire departments being put on standby, and civil defense officials asking about radiation monitoring equipment. Whatever had come down was generating serious official interest. The sun was setting behind the ridgelines, painting the winter sky in shades of orange and purple. Bare trees stretched skeletal branches against the darkening sky, and the first stars were becoming visible in the clear air. It was the kind of peaceful Pennsylvania evening that made you forget about Cold War tensions and space races and all the other anxieties of the modern world. I had no idea I was driving towards something that would haunt me for decades. The first sign something was seriously wrong came at the intersection of Route 982 and what the locals called Meteor Road, a name that would prove prophetic. A Pennsylvania State Police cruiser sat across the lane, its red and blue lights cutting through the gathering dusk. Trooper R. Hale stepped out as I approached, his hand resting casually on his service weapon. Hale was a big man, the kind of rural cop who commanded respect through presence rather than bluster. He'd probably been dealing with curiosity seekers and reporters all evening, and his patience was clearly wearing thin. "Roads closed," he said simply, shining his flashlight through my windshield to get a look at me. I showed him my Bell telephone identification and work order. "Got a report of equipment damage. Need to check the cutover hut up this road." Hale studied my credentials for a long moment, comparing the photo to my face and checking the official letterhead. These guys were thorough, more thorough than you'd expect for a routine traffic control situation. "Phone company," he called to his partner, who was manning a radio in the cruiser. "Let him pass, but I want his name and time logged." He handed back my ID and stepped aside, but I noticed he made a note on his clipboard. That level of documentation wasn't standard for blocking roads around a meteor impact. Someone was keeping very careful track of who went in and out of that area. The narrow lane wound through dense woods, oak and maple trees that had shed their leaves weeks ago, leaving skeletal branches that scraped against my truck. The road surface was rough, more of a logging trail than a proper road, with potholes and ruts that forced me to drive slowly. But as I got deeper into the forest, something felt fundamentally wrong. The air itself seemed different, charged with an ozone smell that reminded me of high-voltage equipment after a lightning strike, mixed with the acrid scent of hot phenolic resin, the kind we used in electrical insulators. There was also something else, a metallic tang that I couldn't identify, but that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Then I saw the trees. They weren't burned exactly. They were snapped inward, all leaning toward a central point maybe 50 yards off the road. The pattern was too regular, too precise to be wind damage. It looked like something massive had come down through the canopy, pushing everything aside in a perfect cone of destruction. Some of the larger oaks had been snapped completely in half, their trunks showing fresh white wood where they'd broken under tremendous force. But what really caught my attention was the electromagnetic signature. My portable field strength meter, which I used for checking microwave path clearance, was showing readings that made no sense. There was a strong RF field emanating from somewhere ahead, cycling through frequencies in a pattern that definitely wasn't natural. Whatever was out there was still electrically active. I grabbed my flashlight and test equipment. following what looked like a shallow furrow carved into the forest floor. The groove was maybe 3 feet wide, scraped clean of leaves and topsoil, running in a straight line toward a small clearing ahead. The earth was compressed and fused in places, as if exposed to intense heat, but there was no evidence of fire damage to the surrounding vegetation. The furrow led me through about 100 yards of damaged forest, before opening into a natural clearing where the real mystery waited. Chief Dombrowski of the Kecksburg Volunteer Fire Department was there when I arrived, along with 3 of his men. They stood in a loose semicircle around something that made my engineer's mind struggle to categorize what I was seeing. It was an acorn. That was the only way to describe it. A bronze-coloured acorn, maybe 10 to 12 feet long, and perhaps 8 feet at its widest point, half buried in the soft earth. But this was no natural object. The surface was smooth, machined, with what looked like copper-bronze alloy that still radiated heat despite the December cold. The metalwork was beautiful in its precision, showing no seams or joints, as if the entire structure had been formed from a single piece of metal. Around its widest point ran a dark band, maybe 18 inches wide, covered with markings that definitely weren't letters. The band appeared to be made of a different material, something darker and more heat-resistant than the main body. It was slightly recessed, like it had been designed to accommodate the markings without disrupting the aerodynamic profile of the object. "You see this too, right?" Chief Dombrowski asked, his voice carrying the careful tone of a man questioning his own sanity. "I mean, this isn't some kind of hallucination from carbon monoxide or something?" Dombrowski was a practical man, a volunteer firefighter who'd spent 20 years responding to vehicle accidents, house fires, and natural disasters. He wasn't the type to imagine things or get excited about strange phenomena, but standing there in that clearing, with this impossible object half buried in Pennsylvania soil, even he seemed shaken. I knelt down beside the object, close enough to see the markings clearly and feel the warmth radiating from its surface. The heat wasn't intense, but it was definitely there, a gentle warmth that suggested significant thermal mass cooling down from much higher temperatures. The material felt almost ceramic to the touch, smooth and slightly warm like a coffee cup that had been sitting in the sun. The markings looked like stencils, precise, functional marks rather than any kind of writing or decoration. There were arrows pointing in different directions, tick marks that could have been measurement references, triangular symbols that might have indicated orientation or attitude, and geometric patterns that looked almost like engineering diagrams. One string of marks caught my attention. A left-pointing arrow, followed by a triangle, 2 vertical lines, a circle with what looked like O2 inside it, then a right-pointing arrow. "Chief," I said, pulling out my sketchbook to copy the markings, "this isn't from space. At least not the way people think." The symbols had a functional quality that reminded me of the stenciled markings on military equipment. Serial numbers, part designations, maintenance instructions, safety warnings. These weren't decorative or ceremonial markings. They were the kind of practical notations you'd find on any piece of complex aerospace equipment. As I sketched the markings, I noticed other details that reinforced my growing suspicion that this wasn't extraterrestrial. The object's surface showed what looked like ablation patterns, areas where material had been deliberately burned away during atmospheric entry. The nose cone had the characteristic blunting you'd expect from a heat shield designed to survive re-entry. There were also what appeared to be small ports or vents, sealed now but clearly designed for some kind of gas flow during operation. Dombrowski pulled out a small civil defence Geiger counter, standard equipment for fire departments in those days, when everyone was worried about nuclear accidents and fallout. The device chirped steadily, but not frantically, elevated background radiation, but nothing immediately dangerous. The readings were consistent with what you might expect from equipment that had been exposed to the radiation environment of space, or possibly from radioactive materials used in power systems or scientific instruments. "Hot," he radioed back to his dispatcher. "Pull the boys back to 50 yards. We're getting elevated readings on the CD meter." That's when we heard the trucks. The sound came from back down the lane, heavy vehicles moving slowly over the rough road surface. But these weren't more fire trucks or ambulances. The engine notes were different, deeper, with the distinctive rumble of military diesels under load. Someone with serious resources was responding to this incident, and they were responding fast. I counted at least 3 vehicles, maybe 4, moving in convoy formation. The lead vehicle was already visible through the trees, its headlights cutting through the darkness. But something was wrong with the light pattern. Instead of standard automotive headlights, these looked like military blackout lights, the kind designed to provide illumination without creating visible signatures that could be spotted from aircraft. "Chief," I said, still sketching frantically, "I think we're about to have company." Dombrowski nodded grimly. He'd been in the Pacific during World War II, and he recognised the sound of military vehicles when he heard it. "Boys," he called to his firefighters, "pack up your gear and get ready to move. This just became somebody else's problem." I finished my sketch and tucked the notebook into my jacket pocket. Whatever was coming up that road, I had the feeling that documenting this scene was about to become much more difficult. The object itself remained motionless in its shallow crater, still radiating heat and electromagnetic energy, still defying easy categorization. But as I looked at it one more time, trying to memorize details that my sketch might have missed, I noticed something that would stick with me for decades. Near the base of the object, partially hidden by displaced earth, was what looked like a small panel or access port. The metal around it was slightly discoloured, as if it had been subjected to intense heat, but the panel itself appeared intact. If this thing was alien technology, why would it have panels that looked exactly like the kind of access ports you'd find on any terrestrial spacecraft or aircraft? Why would it have stenciled markings that followed human conventions for technical documentation? Why would its heat shield patterns match what I'd seen in aerospace engineering journals? The more I looked at this object, the more convinced I became that it wasn't from another world, at least not in the way people imagined. It was from our world, but from a part of our world that most people weren't supposed to know existed. They came up the lane with no headlights, 3 vehicles I couldn't quite identify in the gathering darkness. Military, but not standard army green. These were unmarked, flat olive drab, with men in field jackets that could have been M65s, but without any visible insignia or unit patches. The vehicles themselves looked like modified civilian trucks, heavy-duty chassis with military running gear, designed to look unremarkable while carrying specialised equipment. The man who stepped out of the lead vehicle introduced himself simply as Captain Morris. No first name, no unit designation, just Captain. He was maybe 45 years old, with the kind of weathered face that came from spending time outdoors in all kinds of weather. His uniform was military in cut, but deliberately anonymous. No branch insignia, no unit patches, no ribbons or badges that might identify where he came from or who he worked for. Morris moved with the easy authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. He surveyed the scene quickly, taking in the damaged trees, the firefighters' equipment, and the object itself with the practiced eye of someone who'd done this before. This wasn't his first unusual recovery operation. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the flat authority of command, "this area is now under federal jurisdiction. I'll need everyone to step back while my team secures the site." It wasn't a request. More men emerged from the other vehicles, maybe a dozen in total. They moved with military precision, but without the obvious markers you'd expect from regular armed forces. No name tags, no rank insignia, no unit identifiers. Their equipment was high quality but nondescript, military-style gear that could have come from any number of government agencies or private contractors. Trooper Hale appeared from the tree line, his clipboard ready and his radio crackling with traffic from the state police dispatcher. "Need names and contact information from everyone who's been inside the perimeter," he announced, suddenly much more official than he'd been earlier. He photographed my Bell telephone badge with a portable mimeograph unit, sophisticated equipment for a rural police response, the kind of gear that suggested this operation had been planned well in advance. I watched Morris's team work while Hale processed my identification. They moved like a well-rehearsed crew, each man knowing exactly what his job was and how it fit into the larger operation. They threw a canvas shroud over the object, but not before I caught one of them photographing it from multiple angles with professional camera equipment. Then they fitted it with a split cradle that looked purpose-built for the job. curved metal supports that matched the object's contours exactly, as if they'd been manufactured specifically for this type of recovery. The cradle itself was a piece of engineering that impressed me. It was designed to distribute the object's weight evenly, while protecting it from damage during transport. The materials looked like aircraft-grade aluminum, precision-machined and fitted with shock-absorbing mounts. This wasn't improvised equipment thrown together for an emergency response. This was specialised hardware that had been designed, manufactured and stockpiled for exactly this type of situation. They used a portable winch system to load the cradled object onto a lowboy trailer that had appeared as if by magic. The trailer was unmarked but military in design, with heavy-duty suspension and tie-down points that could handle significant loads. The entire loading operation took less than 30 minutes, every movement practiced and efficient. While they worked, I walked the perimeter of the site, ostensibly checking for damage to our communications equipment, but actually trying to document as much as I could without drawing attention to myself. What I found was interesting for several reasons. First, there was indeed real damage to our infrastructure. A burned waveguide isolator at a nearby microwave repeater, the ferret core cracked and discoloured by what looked like intense electromagnetic energy. The damage was recent and severe enough to explain the signal anomalies I detected earlier. This wasn't staged or faked. Something had genuinely disrupted our equipment. Second, the electromagnetic signature was still strong. My field strength meter continued to show elevated readings centred on the crash site, even with the object covered by the canvas shroud. Whatever was generating that energy was still active, still putting out enough RF power to interfere with sensitive electronics. Third, and most intriguingly, I found evidence of previous activity in the area. Tyre tracks in the soft earth that didn't match any of the emergency vehicles currently on scene. The tracks were from heavy trucks, probably military, and they were at least several hours old. Someone had been here before the official response began, someone who'd known exactly where to look and what they'd find. I pocketed the damaged ferret isolator without thinking much about it at the time. Standard procedure for a field technician was to collect failed components for analysis and replacement. But that particular piece of hardware would turn out to be one of the most important pieces of evidence I'd ever handle. By 2300 hours, the convoy was gone. The object, whatever it had been, disappeared under heavy tarps and chains, headed southeast toward what Morris had mentioned in passing was a secure facility for proper analysis. I later learned that the route they took led directly toward Lockbourne Air Force Base in Ohio, which specialised in handling sensitive materials and classified research programs. The cleanup was thorough and professional. Morris's team raked the impact site, collected soil samples that glowed faintly under their ultraviolet inspection lights, and even gathered fragments of damaged bark from the affected trees. They worked systematically, methodically, leaving nothing to chance. By morning, the only evidence of what had happened would be the broken trees themselves, and even those could be explained as storm damage to anyone who didn't know what to look for. But what struck me most about the entire operation was how routine it felt for Morris and his team. They weren't improvising or figuring things out as they went. They had procedures, equipment, and protocols specifically designed for this type of recovery. They'd done this before, probably multiple times, and they expected to do it again. As the last truck disappeared down the lane, I stood in the empty clearing with Chief Dombrowski and tried to process what we'd just witnessed. The forest was quiet now, except for the normal sounds of a December night. Wind through bare branches, the distant hum of traffic on Route 982, the occasional call of a night bird. "Tom," Dombrowski said quietly, "what do you think that really was?" I looked at my sketch one more time before putting it away. "Chief, I think it was ours. I think it was something we built, something that was supposed to come down somewhere else, and now somebody's got a lot of explaining to do to people with security clearances higher than ours." He nodded slowly. "That's what I was thinking too. But if it was ours, why all the secrecy? Why not just say it was a satellite or a test vehicle?" "Because," I said, "sometimes the truth is more dangerous than the mystery. Sometimes people would rather have you wondering about little green men than asking questions about what kind of technology we're actually capable of building." We packed up our equipment and headed back to the road, leaving behind only tyre tracks and trampled vegetation. But we both knew we'd witnessed something significant, something that would stay with us long after the official explanation started appearing in the newspapers. The drive back to town was quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts. But as I reached the main road and saw the normal traffic of a Thursday evening, commuters heading home from late shifts, teenagers cruising the strip, families returning from dinner out, I realised how quickly the extraordinary could become routine again. In a few hours this would all feel like a dream, something that might have happened to someone else. But I had my sketch, and I had the damaged isolator, and I had a growing certainty that what I'd seen in those woods was just the tip of a much larger iceberg that most Americans would never be allowed to see. The official story appeared in the papers the next day, just as I'd expected it would. A meteor had been observed across several states, probably fragments from the annual Geminid shower arriving early. Ground searches in the Kecksburg area had found nothing of significance. Some scorched earth and broken trees, but no meteorite fragments or other debris. Case closed, move along, nothing to see here. The Pittsburgh Post-Gazette ran a small item on page 3. Meteor search yields no evidence. The article quoted state police officials confirming that extensive ground searches had failed to locate any meteorite fragments, despite numerous eyewitness reports of an object impacting in the Kecksburg area. What people saw was probably a very bright meteor that burned up completely before reaching the ground, explained a spokesman for the Allegheny Observatory. KDKA ran both versions, the official meteor explanation and eyewitness accounts of something being recovered from the woods. But they presented the eyewitness stories as curiosities, human interest pieces about people who thought they'd seen something unusual. The official explanation got top billing and authoritative sources. The eyewitness accounts got relegated to the strange but true category that every local news operation used to fill time on slow days. Most people chose to believe the official version. It was tidier, less troubling to the comfortable order of things. Meteors were natural phenomena that happened all the time. Secret government recovery operations were the stuff of science fiction movies and paranoid conspiracy theories. In December 1965, most Americans still trusted their government to tell them the truth about important matters. I went back to my regular duties, maintaining the microwave relays that carried America's conversations across the continent. The damaged isolator was replaced with a standard unit from our repair stock, and within a week the entire communications path was back to normal operation. The incident was noted in my maintenance log as equipment failure due to electromagnetic interference from natural phenomena, which was technically accurate even if it didn't tell the whole story. But I couldn't shake what I'd seen. The image of that bronze acorn half buried in Pennsylvania soil kept returning to me during quiet moments. The precise markings on its dark band, the professional efficiency of the recovery operation, the obvious familiarity that Morris's team had shown with the entire procedure. All of it suggested something much more complex than a simple meteor impact. I labelled a shoebox KECKSBURG and filed away a Polaroid of the damaged isolator, my hand-drawn sketch of the band markings, and the time slips from that evening. I wasn't sure why I was saving them, but some instinct told me they might be important someday. Then I tried to get on with life. The 1970s brought significant changes to the communications industry. The longlines network was gradually being converted from analog microwave to digital systems. Satellite links were becoming more common, and the entire structure of American telecommunications was evolving rapidly. I found myself working on increasingly sophisticated equipment, systems that would have been pure science fiction just a few years earlier. But the changes also brought new neighbours and new social connections. Westinghouse had a significant presence in the Pittsburgh area, including their Astronuclear Laboratory, WANL, which had been working on nuclear rocket programs and heat shield technology for NASA. The NERVA project, which was developing nuclear thermal rockets for deep space missions, had generated a lot of advanced research into materials that could survive extreme temperatures and radiation environments. Over backyard barbecues and community events, I started picking up fragments of conversation from Westinghouse engineers who worked on these programs. They talked about ablative heat shields designed to protect spacecraft during atmospheric re-entry, about beryllium copper alloys that could withstand tremendous heat loads, about phenolic resin composites that charred away in controlled patterns to carry away thermal energy. I logged these conversations in a notebook, not sure why, but following an instinct that someday the pieces might fit together. The technical details they mentioned, the materials, the design approaches, the testing procedures, all seemed somehow relevant to what I'd seen in that forest clearing. But the connections remained tantalisingly vague, hints and suggestions rather than concrete evidence. During this period, I also became more aware of the broader context of aerospace development in the 1960s. The space race between the United States and Soviet Union had generated enormous investments in advanced technology, much of it classified and developed in parallel with the public NASA programs. Military research into reconnaissance satellites, communication platforms, and strategic defense systems was creating capabilities that the general public knew nothing about. The more I learned about these parallel programs, the more convinced I became that what had come down at Kecksburg was related to this hidden side of the space program. The object's design, the government's response, the professional efficiency of the recovery operation, all of it pointed to something that was both highly advanced and highly classified. But I also learned to keep my suspicions to myself. The 1970s were a time of growing skepticism about government secrecy, but they were also a time when asking too many questions about classified programs could have serious consequences for your career and your security clearance. I was a communications technician with access to sensitive systems and facilities. Drawing attention to myself by pursuing conspiracy theories would not have been a wise career move, so I kept my documentation, maintained my notes, and waited for more information to surface. I had the patience that comes from working in technical fields, the understanding that complex problems often take years or decades to resolve, and that the most important insights often come from seemingly unrelated developments that suddenly reveal new patterns and connections. I also developed relationships with other technical personnel who might have relevant information. Ham radio operators, aerospace engineers, military contractors, research scientists, the informal network of people who worked on advanced technology projects, and might have insights into what the government was actually capable of building. These conversations were always careful, always indirect. Nobody wanted to violate security regulations or compromise classified programs. But over time, I began to piece together a picture of just how advanced American aerospace capabilities had become by the mid-1960s, and how much of that advancement was hidden from public view. The hints came in fragments, stories about test flights that never appeared in public records, about facilities that didn't officially exist, about research programs that had been terminated without explanation. Individual pieces meant nothing, but together they suggested a shadow aerospace industry that was decades ahead of what most people imagined was possible. By the late 1970s, I had assembled enough circumstantial evidence to be fairly confident in my basic theory. What had come down at Kecksburg was an American test vehicle or satellite that had malfunctioned and come down in the wrong place. The recovery operation had been professional because it was routine. This was the kind of contingency that classified programs planned for and prepared to handle. But I still didn't have proof, and I wasn't sure I wanted it. The more I learned about the security apparatus surrounding advanced aerospace programs, the more I understood that pursuing this investigation too aggressively could have serious personal consequences. I was a technician with security clearance and access to sensitive facilities. Drawing the wrong kind of attention could end my career and potentially result in criminal charges, so I continued to collect information passively, filing away documents and conversations that might be relevant, but avoiding any active investigation that might trigger security concerns. I told myself I was being cautious and responsible. Looking back, I think I was probably being scared. The 1980s brought new developments that added context to my growing understanding of the incident. The Strategic Defense Initiative generated enormous investments in advanced materials and propulsion systems. Reports began surfacing about stealth technology that had been under development for decades. The Space Shuttle program revealed capabilities that had been theoretical just a few years earlier. All of these developments reinforce my belief that American aerospace technology in the 1960s had been far more advanced than most people realized. The materials, science, the propulsion systems, the guidance and control technology, all of it suggested that building something like what I'd seen at Kecksburg would have been technically feasible, if politically and financially challenging. But the 1980s also brought the first serious challenges to the official story about Kecksburg. Researchers began filing Freedom of Information Act requests, seeking government documents about the incident. Journalists started investigating the eyewitness accounts more seriously. Former military personnel began speaking publicly about their involvement in unusual recovery operations. None of these developments produced definitive proof of what had really happened, but they did establish that the official explanation was incomplete at best. Too many credible witnesses had seen too many things that didn't fit the meteor story. Too many government agencies had responded too quickly and too professionally for this to have been a routine natural phenomenon. I followed these developments with great interest, but I remained reluctant to contribute my own evidence to the growing body of research. I was still working in the communications industry, still maintaining security clearances, still vulnerable to retaliation if I violated secrecy agreements I'd never actually signed, but that everyone understood were implicit in the job. But I also began to realise that my documentation might be uniquely valuable. My technical background gave me insights that most UFO researchers lacked. My presence at the scene as an official responder, rather than a curious bystander, gave my testimony a credibility that most eyewitness accounts couldn't match. And my collection of physical evidence, the damaged isolator, the technical sketches, the contemporary documentation, provided objective support for claims that might otherwise be dismissed as fantasy or misremembering. As the 1980s turned into the 1990s, I found myself increasingly torn between the desire to contribute to historical understanding and the need to protect my career and personal security. It was a tension that would ultimately define the rest of my relationship with the Kecksburg incident. Retirement gave me time to think, and the internet gave me tools I'd never had before. Suddenly I could research topics that would have required trips to libraries and archives, communicate with researchers and witnesses scattered across the country, and access government documents that had been declassified or leaked over the decades since the incident. The first major breakthrough came in 2001, when Mike Romano, an aging firefighter who'd been at Kecksburg that night, went public with his story in a way that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. Romano had been a young volunteer with the Kecksburg 5FD in 1965, and he'd gotten closer to the object than most of the other witnesses. His account was detailed, specific, and consistent with what I remembered from my own observations. Romano described seeing an acorn-shaped object about the size of a small car, with a bronze or copper-coloured surface that was still warm to the touch. Around its widest point was a band of darker material covered with writing like Egyptian hieroglyphs, markings that were clearly artificial, but unlike any human writing system he'd ever seen. The object had been loaded onto an army flatbed truck and transported away, with rumours that it eventually went to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base and then to Lockbourne. What made Romano's account particularly credible was his technical background and his obvious reluctance to go public. He was a career firefighter and emergency responder, trained to observe accurately under stressful conditions and not given to fantasy or exaggeration. He'd waited 35 years to tell his story, and he was clearly uncomfortable with the attention it generated. These weren't the characteristics of someone seeking publicity or trying to perpetuate a hoax. Romano's description of the markings on the dark band matched my own sketches closely enough to be convincing. He remembered arrows, triangular shapes, and geometric patterns that looked more like technical diagrams than decorative art. He also remembered the professional efficiency of the recovery operation and the obvious familiarity that the military personnel had shown with the procedures. That same year, NASA found itself in a Freedom of Information Act dust-up over Kecksburg documents that would prove to be a watershed moment in the case. Researchers had been filing FOIA requests with various government agencies for years, usually receiving responses that claimed no relevant documents existed or that any relevant documents were classified and couldn't be released. But NASA's initial response to a 2001 FOIA request was different and contradictory. They claimed to have no records related to the Kecksburg incident, but researchers had already found references to the incident in archived NASA memos and technical reports. The contradiction was obvious enough to attract media attention and generate pressure for a more thorough document search. The controversy made national news, with major newspapers and television networks running stories about the government's contradictory claims regarding Kecksburg. For the first time since 1965, the incident was receiving serious attention from mainstream media outlets, rather than just UFO researchers and conspiracy theorists. I followed these developments closely, comparing the new information with my own documentation and memories. What emerged was a picture that was both more complex and more mundane than either the official meteor explanation or the extraterrestrial theories that had grown up around the incident. I pulled out my old sketch of the band markings and started comparing them to technical documents I could access online. The internet had made available enormous amounts of previously classified or restricted aerospace documentation, technical papers, research reports, declassified military studies, and academic research that had been inaccessible to civilian researchers in previous decades. What I found in an old AIAA paper made my hands shake. The markings I'd copied in 1965 weren't hieroglyphs or alien writing. They were re-entry orientation stencils, the kind used to indicate pitch, roll, and attitude references on test vehicles and spacecraft. The left arrow, triangle, parallel lines, circle with O2, and right arrow made perfect sense if you read them as pitch reference, nose attitude indicator, roll markers, oxygen system designation, and thrust vector indicator. These were maintenance stencils as mundane and functional as the identification plates on any piece of complex equipment, but they were also sophisticated enough to suggest advanced aerospace technology. The precision of the markings, the materials used in the band itself, and the integration with what was obviously a carefully designed heat shield system all pointed to something much more advanced than what most people imagined was possible in 1965. I arranged a coffee meeting with Ellen Brooks, a retired Westinghouse engineer I'd met through the local historical society. Ellen had worked on advanced materials research for the aerospace industry, including heat shield development for both civilian and military applications. I didn't tell her why I was interested in heat shield technology, just that I was researching local aerospace history for a personal project. Ellen was pleasant but careful, the way people get when they've spent careers working on classified projects. She was obviously intelligent and knowledgeable, but she chose her words carefully and avoided any specific details that might compromise sensitive information. It was a conversation style I recognised from years of working with people who held security clearances, informative but careful, helpful but circumspect. But when I mentioned Kecksburg, her demeanour shifted slightly. Not dramatically, but enough to suggest that the name meant something to her. She paused for a moment, studying my face, then asked quietly why I was interested in that particular incident. I told her I'd been there that night as a Bell telephone technician, that I'd seen the object before it was recovered, and that I'd been puzzled by it ever since. I showed her my sketch of the band markings, explaining that I'd been trying to understand what they might have meant. Ellen studied the sketch for several minutes, occasionally glancing up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Finally, she slid a napkin across the table and began writing on it in careful block letters: phenolic impregnated carbon ablator, beryllium copper studs, Mark Series, not Cosmos 96. She finished her coffee and left without another word, but she left the napkin behind. Back home, I researched the terms Ellen had written. Phenolic impregnated carbon was the advanced ablative material used in heat shields for spacecraft and re-entry vehicles. Beryllium copper alloys were used in high-temperature applications where both strength and thermal conductivity were important. The Mark Series designation suggested a family of related vehicles or test articles, and not Cosmos 96 was particularly intriguing. Cosmos 96 was a Soviet spacecraft that had reportedly failed during re-entry in 1965, and some researchers had suggested it might have been what came down at Kecksburg. Yet Ellen's note was telling me that whatever had crashed at Kecksburg was made of sophisticated American materials, was part of a series of related vehicles and was definitely not the Soviet spacecraft that some people had theorized. It was American technology, advanced American technology, and it was part of a larger program that had produced multiple similar vehicles. I took another look at the ferry isolator I'd pocketed in 1965, 35 years after the incident. By this time, I had access to better testing equipment through a friend at the local college who ran a materials analysis laboratory. We could perform spectroscopic analysis that would have been impossible in 1965, and the results were fascinating. The spectrum analysis showed clear evidence of sodium-potassium contamination, NaK, the liquid metal coolant used in space nuclear power systems. There was also an odd bismuth trace that could have come from neutron-shielding materials used in nuclear reactors or radioisotope thermoelectric generators. The contamination patterns suggested exposure to operating nuclear systems, not just residual radiation from natural sources or weapons testing fallout. This was physical evidence that whatever had come down at Kecksburg had been equipped with nuclear power systems of some kind. In 1965, that technology existed but was highly classified and limited to the most advanced military and space programs. It wasn't the kind of capability that appeared in natural phenomena or even most conventional spacecraft. The implications were becoming clear, even as they raised more questions than they answered. What had crashed at Kecksburg was an American nuclear-powered spacecraft or re-entry vehicle, sophisticated enough to require advanced heat shield materials and precise enough to need detailed orientation markings for maintenance and handling. It was part of a series of similar vehicles, suggesting an ongoing program rather than a one-off experiment, but it was also something that the government considered sensitive enough to require immediate recovery and continued secrecy decades after the fact. That level of protection suggested technology that was either still classified or related to programs that remained sensitive for political or strategic reasons. By 2003, I had assembled what I believed was a coherent picture of what had happened at Kecksburg. It wasn't extraterrestrial. It wasn't a simple meteor. It was a classified American re-entry vehicle or nuclear-powered satellite that had malfunctioned and come down intact in the wrong place, revealing technology the government preferred to keep secret. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. The sophisticated materials Ellen had identified, the nuclear contamination I'd found in the isolator, the professional efficiency of the recovery operation, the ongoing secrecy surrounding government documents related to the incident. Individual pieces might be explained away, but together they painted a clear picture of advanced American aerospace technology, operating under deep classification. But proving this theory and making it public were two different things. I had evidence, but much of it was technical and difficult for non-experts to evaluate. I had connections to knowledgeable people, but most of them were constrained by security agreements and professional obligations. And I had personal risks to consider. Even in retirement, revealing classified information could have serious legal consequences. I began to draft a comprehensive report documenting my theory and the evidence supporting it. My plan was to contact a journalist who'd been covering the NASA FOIA controversy and provide them with a complete package that would finally explain what had really happened at Kecksburg. It would include photographs of the damaged isolator, my original sketch of the markings, the spectroscopic analysis results, Ellen's materials identification, and a detailed timeline connecting all the pieces. I spent weeks preparing the report, checking facts, verifying sources, and organising the evidence in a way that would be compelling to both journalists and the general public. This would be my contribution to historical understanding, my way of finally revealing the truth about an incident that had shaped my life for nearly 40 years. I was preparing to mail the package when I heard the knock at my door. It was past 10 in the evening, unusual for visitors in my rural neighbourhood. I lived on a quiet street in a small town outside Greensburg, the kind of place where people knew their neighbours, and unexpected late-night visits were rare enough to be noteworthy. But there he was on my porch, a man in his 60s, professionally dressed despite the late hour, with the kind of bearing that immediately suggested government service. He showed me credentials identifying him as retired Air Force Office of Special Investigations, but the badge looked current enough, and his manner suggested he was still working in some capacity. OSI was the Air Force's primary investigative and counterintelligence organisation, the people responsible for protecting sensitive programs and investigating security breaches. "Mr. Brennan," he said, his voice carrying the flat authority of someone accustomed to being taken seriously, "I wonder if we could have a conversation about your service to the Longlines network, particularly your reliability during the incident of December 9th, 1965. I invited him in because refusing would have accomplished nothing, and because I was curious to hear what he had to say. This was obviously related to my research into the Kecksburg incident, but I wasn't sure how they'd learned about it or what they wanted from me." He introduced himself as Agent William Fletcher, though I suspected that wasn't his real name. He moved through my living room with the practiced eye of someone trained in observation and threat assessment, noting the layout, the exits, and anything that might be relevant to his mission. But he was polite about it, professional rather than threatening. Fletcher began by thanking me for my decades of faithful service to the Longlines network, noting that technicians like me had been the backbone of America's strategic communications during the Cold War. He was well informed about my career, mentioning specific assignments and commendations that weren't part of any public record. Someone had done their homework on me, and they'd done it thoroughly. "Your work was critical to national security," he said, settling into my favourite chair as if he belonged there. "The microwave relay systems you maintained carried some of the most sensitive communications in the government. Military command and control, diplomatic cables, intelligence reports. All of it depended on people like you keeping the systems operational under all conditions." He was correct, of course. The Longlines network had been designed to survive nuclear attack, to keep the government functioning even under the most extreme circumstances. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, every communication between Washington and Moscow had probably passed through equipment I'd personally maintained. It was a responsibility that had shaped my entire career. "We're particularly grateful for your discretion and professionalism during unusual incidents," Fletcher continued. "The events of December the 9th, 1965, for example. Your response was exemplary. You focused on your technical responsibilities, documented equipment damage appropriately, and didn't allow curiosity to interfere with operational security." Then he placed 2 documents on my kitchen table: a pension enhancement agreement that would significantly increase my retirement benefits, and a non-disclosure agreement with specific references to events observed during routine maintenance activities in Westmoreland County, December 1965. The pension enhancement was substantial, enough to make a real difference in my quality of life during retirement. It was presented as a recognition of my long service and the strategic importance of the work I'd done, a gesture of appreciation from a grateful nation for my contributions to national security. The non-disclosure agreement was more complex. It acknowledged that I had observed certain events during the course of my official duties, events that were related to classified national security programs that remained sensitive decades after they had occurred. By signing, I would agree not to discuss, publish, or otherwise reveal any information related to these events without prior written authorization from appropriate government agencies. "Mr. Brennan," Fletcher said, his tone remaining conversational but carrying an undertone of serious authority, "here's how we see it. If what came down at Kecksburg was ours, we don't publish details about classified defense programs. Those programs were designed to protect American interests during a dangerous time, and revealing their capabilities could still compromise national security or give advantages to potential adversaries." He paused to let that sink in, then continued. "If what came down wasn't ours, we definitely don't publish details about our response to unknown intrusions into US airspace. The procedures for handling such incidents, the capabilities we bring to bear, the facilities we use for analysis, all of that information could be valuable to people who might want to test our defences or exploit our vulnerabilities." The logic was compelling, even if I didn't like the implications. Fletcher was telling me that either way, whether the object was American technology or something else entirely, revealing the truth would damage national security. It was a perfect catch-22, a logical trap that made secrecy the only acceptable option, regardless of what had actually happened. "Either way, publication serves no constructive purpose," Fletcher concluded. "The incident has become folklore, a modern mystery that generates books and documentaries and tourism revenue for the local area. People are free to speculate and theorise, but hard evidence, official documentation, technical analysis that crosses the line from harmless mystery into potential security compromise. He was polite, even friendly, but the message was clear. I could keep my theories and my memories, but my evidence needed to disappear, and my public silence needed to be guaranteed. I looked at the pension enhancement agreement. The money was real and substantial, enough to secure my retirement and provide for my wife's medical care. I looked at the non-disclosure agreement. The legal language was precise and comprehensive, covering not just what I might say, but what documents I might share, what evidence I might reveal, what connections I might help other researchers make. What about the truth, I asked. What about history? Don't people have a right to know what their government is capable of? Fletcher smiled, but it wasn't a warm expression. Mr. Brennan, the truth is that in December 1965, the United States government was conducting advanced aerospace research designed to protect this country from existential threats. Some of that research involved technologies and capabilities that were decades ahead of anything our adversaries possessed. Some of it involved risks and experiments that the general public wouldn't have understood or supported. He leaned forward slightly. The truth is that one of those experimental vehicles malfunctioned and came down in the wrong place. The recovery operation worked exactly as planned. The technology was secured, the security breach was contained, and potential intelligence compromises were prevented. The system worked. But people saw it, I protested. Witnesses, firefighters, police officers, you can't make all of them sign agreements. We don't need to, Fletcher replied. Witnesses without evidence are just telling stories. Evidence without context is just interesting artifacts. You're the only person who has both the technical background to understand what you saw and the physical evidence to prove it. You're the only one who can connect all the pieces into a coherent picture that threatens operational security. He was right, and we both knew it. My technical training, my presence at the scene, my collection of evidence, and my decades of investigation had given me a unique understanding of what had happened. Without my testimony and evidence, the Kecksburg incident would remain what it had always been. A fascinating mystery with no definitive resolution. I thought about Ellen Brooks, who had spent her career working on classified aerospace programs and had shared just enough information to point me toward the truth while protecting herself from security violations. I thought about Mike Romano, whose honest testimony about what he'd seen had contributed to historical understanding while carefully avoiding any claims about what the object actually was. I thought about the bigger picture, the Cold War context that had made such programs necessary, the technological achievements that had remained hidden for decades, the ongoing security considerations that might still make secrecy advisable, and I thought about my wife, whose medical bills were mounting, and my own financial security and retirement. I signed the papers. The ferret isolator sits in my desk drawer now, next to Ellen Brooks's napkin, and my original sketch of the band markings. The shoebox labelled Kecksburg went to my lawyer with instructions that it remain sealed for 25 years after my death, long enough for any remaining security concerns to become irrelevant, but soon enough that the historical record might eventually be corrected. The pension enhancement made the last years of my wife's life comfortable and gave me the financial security to enjoy retirement without constant worry about money. Fletcher had been as good as his word. The benefits were real and substantial, a genuine expression of government gratitude for my service and my silence. Sometimes I drive out to Chestnut Ridge and look west toward Kecksburg. The microwave tower still blinks its steady red warning light, still carries conversations across the continent, though most of the traffic is digital now rather than analog. KDKA still broadcasts from Pittsburgh, though the voices have changed and the format has shifted with the times. The Kecksburg incident has become exactly what Fletcher predicted. A modern folklore, a tourist attraction, a source of books and documentaries and speculation. Every few years someone publishes a new theory, or claims to have found new evidence. NASA occasionally releases previously classified documents that add fragments to the puzzle without resolving the central mystery. What I know now, what I couldn't understand then, is that some truths are more complicated than simple revelation can handle. The object that came down in those woods was real, but it was also part of a larger story about American technological capabilities during the Cold War, about the costs and benefits of secrecy in a democratic society, about the tension between public curiosity and national security. The acorn-shaped vehicle was almost certainly an American experimental re-entry vehicle, probably nuclear-powered, possibly part of a reconnaissance or early warning satellite program that was decades ahead of publicly acknowledged capabilities. The markings on its band were maintenance stencils, the materials were advanced heat shield composites, and the recovery operation was professional because it was routine, the kind of contingency that classified programs plan for and prepare to handle. But proving that wouldn't have served any constructive purpose. It would have revealed capabilities that might still be sensitive, compromised technologies that might still be classified, and expose programs that might still be operational under different names and configurations. The real cover-up at Kecksburg wasn't about hiding proof of extraterrestrial visitation. It was about maintaining operational security around classified defense programs during the height of the Cold War. The object that came down was exotic enough to be worth protecting, but terrestrial enough that protection was both possible and necessary. Fletcher was right about something else too. The mystery serves a purpose that the facts might only diminish. Kecksburg has become a place where people can project their hopes and fears about technology, government secrecy, and humanity's place in the universe. It's a space where the impossible feels possible, where the boundaries between known and unknown remain negotiable. Maybe that's more valuable than the truth. Maybe some mysteries are worth preserving. But on clear nights, when I'm up late and can't sleep, I sometimes take out the ferret isolator and hold it up to the light. The crack patterns in the ferret core tell a story about electromagnetic forces and thermal stress, about technology pushed beyond its design limits in service of purposes I can only guess at. The truth is in there, waiting in that damaged component like a message in a bottle. Someday, when the security considerations have faded and the political concerns have become irrelevant, maybe someone will decode that message and understand what really fell from the sky on December 9th, 1965. Until then, the mystery endures, and maybe that's exactly how it should be. The Kecksburg incident taught me that truth isn't always about revelation. Sometimes it's about understanding the difference between what we can know and what we should say, between what happened and what it means, between facts and their consequences. I kept my word to Fletcher, but I also kept my evidence. The story will survive, even if it has to wait for a better time to be told, and in the meantime, people are free to wonder, to speculate, to imagine possibilities that might be more interesting than the mundane reality of classified aerospace programs and bureaucratic cover-ups. The acorn still turns in its crater in my dreams, bronze surfaces gleaming in the December twilight, its band of markings spelling out secrets in a language only engineers understand. It was ours, but we built it to touch the impossible. In the end, maybe that's alien enough. Welcome to another spine-chilling tale from Sleep Theories. Before we dive into tonight's story about streets that vanish and realities that shift, I want to give a special thanks to Meditate, Create and Valensrocks for suggesting this incredible concept. Your ideas fuel these stories, so please keep those video suggestions coming in the comments below. And if you enjoy these mysterious tales that blur the line between nightmare and reality, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to Sleep Theories for more stories that will keep you awake long into the night. Now, settle in and prepare yourself for a journey into a world where familiar places become foreign, where your own memories might be the only proof of what once was real. The city looks different at 3 in the morning. Streetlights cast long shadows between buildings, and the usual chaos of traffic gives way to an almost sacred quiet. I've been driving rideshare for 4 years now, working the night shift because the money's better and honestly I prefer the solitude. There's something honest about the night. People are either going somewhere important or running from something they'd rather forget. My phone buzzed with a new ride request just as I finished dropping off a group of college kids downtown. The pickup was on Maple Avenue, and the destination showed as 1247 Warren Street. I knew the area well, had driven through it hundreds of times. Warren Street ran parallel to the University District, lined with old brownstones that had been converted into apartments for students and young professionals. The passenger was already waiting outside when I pulled up. Middle-aged woman with greying hair clutching a small overnight bag. She looked tired in that bone-deep way that comes from more than just staying up late. "You're going to Warren Street," I confirmed as she settled into the back seat. "Yes, 1247. Thank you for coming so quickly." Her voice carried a slight accent I couldn't place. I've been visiting my sister there for years, but tonight, I'm not sure why, but I kept getting turned around trying to find it myself. I pulled away from the curb and headed toward the familiar route. The GPS showed a straight shot, down Maple, left on University, then right onto Warren Street. Simple enough. I'd probably driven that exact route 50 times this year alone. "How long has your sister lived there?" I asked, making conversation to fill the comfortable silence. "Oh, about 15 years now. Same apartment the whole time. She's always joking about how she'll never move because she finally memorized her address." The woman laughed softly. "Though between you and me, the neighbourhood has changed quite a bit. Not necessarily for the worse, just different." We made the left onto University Avenue, passing the late-night coffee shop that catered to cramming students and the 24-hour laundromat where I'd seen the same homeless man sleeping in the doorway for the past 2 years. Everything looked normal, exactly as it should. Then I made the right turn where Warren Street should have been. The street sign read Miller Avenue in crisp official lettering. Not a makeshift replacement or a temporary sign. This looked like it had been there for decades. The metal showed the right amount of weathering, the same faded green paint as all the other street signs in the district. I slowed the car, checking my GPS. The blue line still showed us travelling on Warren Street, but the street sign clearly said Miller Avenue. I glanced in my rearview mirror at my passenger, who was looking out the window with a puzzled expression. "This is strange," she murmured. "This doesn't look quite right." I pulled over and studied the buildings. They were similar to what I remembered. The same general style of architecture, the same height and spacing. But the details were wrong. The corner building had been painted a warm terracotta colour in my memory. Now it was a muted sage green. The small community garden that used to occupy the lot between 2 apartment buildings had been replaced by a pocket park with different trees, different layout, different everything. "The address should be right down there," I said, pointing toward where the 1200 block should have been. But even the building numbers seemed off somehow. My passenger was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the street. "This is Miller Avenue," she said finally. "But I could have sworn. I've been coming here for 15 years. I know this was Warren Street last week." We drove slowly down the block looking for 1247. We found it, a narrow brownstone wedged between 2 larger buildings with the right number painted on the door. But something felt fundamentally wrong about the whole scene, like looking at a photograph where someone had digitally altered small details. "This is it," my passenger said as we pulled up to the address. But she didn't sound certain. She sat in the car for several more seconds studying the building. The door used to be blue. I'm sure it was blue last time I was here. The door was dark green with paint that looked like it had been that colour for years. She paid me through the app and got out, but hesitated on the sidewalk. "Driver, you've been through this area before, right? Have you ever heard of Warren Street?" I nodded slowly. I thought I had. I could have sworn this was Warren Street. So did I. She walked toward the building, then turned back one more time. Maybe we're both just tired. Maybe I've been calling it the wrong name all these years. But as I drove away, checking my mirrors to make sure I was heading in the right direction, I knew she was wrong. I had definitely driven down Warren Street before, many times, and it had definitely been Warren Street, not Miller Avenue. I made a mental note to check my paper map when I got home. I kept an old road atlas in my glove compartment, one of those habits left over from before GPS became reliable. But first I had 3 more rides to finish before my shift ended. The rest of the night passed normally, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. It was like when you rearrange furniture in a room you've lived in for years. Everything is technically correct, but your body keeps expecting things to be in the wrong places. By the time I got home at dawn, I'd almost convinced myself it was just fatigue. Night shift work can play tricks on your mind, especially after working 6 straight days. Maybe I had been misremembering the street name. Maybe my passenger had too. Stranger coincidences had happened. But as I sat in my driveway watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, one thought kept nagging at me. If it had always been Miller Avenue, why did my GPS still think we had been travelling on Warren Street? I slept until 3 in the afternoon, which was normal for my schedule, but the dreams were anything but normal. All night long, I kept dreaming about driving down familiar streets that led to places I'd never seen before. In one dream, I was trying to get home, but every turn led to a different version of my neighbourhood. Same houses, different colours, different numbers, different trees. When I finally dragged myself out of bed and made coffee, the first thing I did was dig through my glove compartment for my paper road atlas. It was a 2019 edition, still relatively new, with detailed street maps of the entire metropolitan area. I flipped to page 47, the section that covered the University District. My finger traced down University Avenue to the intersection where I had made the right turn the night before. Warren Street, clear as day, printed in the same font as every other street name on the map. Not Miller Avenue, Warren Street, exactly where I remembered it being. I stared at the map for several minutes, then checked the GPS on my phone. When I searched for Warren Street in that area, it came up with no results. When I searched for Miller Avenue, it showed exactly the route I had driven the night before. Something cold settled in my stomach. I grabbed my laptop and started searching online for any information about street name changes in the University District. The city's official records showed that Miller Avenue had been established in 1987 and had never been renamed. There was no mention of Warren Street anywhere in the municipal database. On impulse, I created a post on the city's community forum. Does anyone remember Warren Street in the University District? It used to run parallel to the campus, between University Avenue and Oak Street. Now it's called Miller Avenue, and I can't find any record of when the name was changed. I included a photo of my paper map showing Warren Street clearly labelled. The first few responses came within an hour. Yeah, I remember Warren Street. I used to live there in 2018. When did they change it? Warren Street? My ex-boyfriend lived on that street. I always thought it was a weird coincidence because his last name was Warren. I delivered pizza in that area for 3 years. Definitely remember Warren Street. Strange that there's no record of the name change. But then other responses started coming in. Are you guys serious? That's been Miller Avenue for as long as I can remember, and I've lived here for 30 years. This is obviously fake. Why would you create a fake street name and Photoshop it onto a map? Miller Avenue was named after the Miller family who donated the land to the city in 1887. It's never been called anything else. The thread quickly devolved into arguments between people who insisted they remembered Warren Street and people who were equally certain it had always been Miller Avenue. By evening, the tone had turned ugly, with accusations of lying and attention-seeking behaviour. I went to bed that night feeling unsettled but oddly vindicated. At least I wasn't the only one who remembered Warren Street. Maybe there was a reasonable explanation. Perhaps the city had renamed it recently and hadn't updated all their records yet. When I woke up the next afternoon, I checked the forum thread immediately. The post was gone. Not deleted, with a note saying it had been removed for violating community guidelines. Completely gone, as if it had never existed. My post history showed no record of ever creating it. More disturbing, when I checked my paper map again, page 47 now showed Miller Avenue, where Warren Street had been printed the day before. The font was identical to all the other street names, and the paper showed no signs of alteration. It looked exactly like it had been printed that way originally. I sat at my kitchen table staring at the map, trying to convince myself that I had misremembered what I had seen. But I distinctly recalled running my finger along the printed words Warren Street, less than 24 hours earlier. I grabbed my phone and tried searching online for any cached versions of my forum post, any screenshots, any evidence that it had ever existed. I found nothing. That night, instead of starting my usual rideshare shift, I drove back to Miller Avenue. I parked across the street from where I had dropped off my passenger and studied the buildings more carefully. The corner building was definitely sage green, and the paint job looked professional and weathered, but something about the colour seemed wrong to my eyes, like seeing a familiar person wearing an outfit that doesn't quite suit them. The pocket park was well established, with mature trees and worn paths that suggested it had been there for years. I walked through the small park looking for any signs of recent construction or landscaping changes. The trees were all at least 10 years old, maybe more. The memorial plaque near the entrance was dated 2009, dedicating the space to the Miller Avenue Community Garden Preservation Society. But I could swear I remembered a different garden in this exact spot. A smaller space with raised vegetable beds and a chain-link fence, not this manicured little park with its neat flower borders and decorative benches. As I stood there in the evening light, a woman walked by walking her dog. She was middle-aged, looked like she lived in the neighbourhood. "Excuse me," I called out. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I'm trying to settle a bet with a friend. Do you happen to know if this street used to be called something else?" She stopped and looked at me suspiciously. "Miller Avenue?" "No, it's always been Miller Avenue. My grandmother lived on this street in the 1940s. Family's been here for generations." "What about this park? Has it always been here?" Now she looked at me like I might be mentally unstable. "The Miller Community Park?" "Of course it's always been here. Are you from the area?" "I thought I was," I said. "Thanks anyway." As I walked back to my car, I noticed something that made me freeze in place. Across the street, leaning against a lamppost, was a man in a dark jacket who seemed to be watching me. When I looked directly at him, he turned away and started walking in the opposite direction. Maybe it was paranoia, but something about his posture had suggested he'd been observing me for a while. I got in my car and drove home, checking my rearview mirror more frequently than usual. I didn't see the man again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that my questions about Warren Street had attracted unwanted attention. That night I started keeping a notebook by my bed. I wrote down everything I could remember about Warren Street, the colour of buildings, the storefronts, the layout of the street. If my own maps couldn't be trusted to stay consistent, at least I could document what I remembered while the memories were still clear. I had no way of knowing it then, but that notebook would become my only anchor to reality in the days to come. 3 days later, I decided to do a systematic survey of the university district. If Warren Street could disappear and be replaced by Miller Avenue, what else might have changed? I armed myself with my notebook and drove to the area in the late afternoon when the lighting was good for observation. I started at the corner of University and Miller, the intersection I thought I knew so well. The first thing I noticed was the mural on the side wall of the Riverside Grocery Building. I had admired that mural dozens of times while waiting at the traffic light. It depicted a World War II soldier in uniform saluting against a backdrop of an American flag. The plaque at the bottom read, "In honour of local veterans, painted by Lincoln High School Art Class 2017. But the face was wrong. I sat in my parked car, staring at the mural, trying to understand what I was seeing. The soldier's features were different. Broader jaw, different nose, darker hair. The uniform was the same, the pose identical, but it was definitely not the same face I remembered. The original soldier had looked younger, with lighter hair and a more angular face. I got out and walked closer to examine the plaque. The bronze was weathered in a way that suggested it had been there for years. There was no sign of the recent replacement or alteration. According to this plaque, Lincoln High School's art class had painted this specific mural in 2017, and I was sure I had been seeing it regularly since at least 2019. I took several photos of the mural and made detailed notes about the differences I remembered. The next stop was Murphy's Diner, 3 blocks down Miller Avenue. I had eaten there probably 20 times over the past 2 years. Decent coffee, good breakfast, friendly staff who knew the night shift workers in the area. The neon sign in the window had always been slightly crooked, and the owner, an elderly man named Murphy, always wore the same green apron. But Murphy's Diner was gone. In its place stood Riverside Pharmacy, with a crisp new sign and a bright, sterile interior visible through large windows. The building was the same shape and size, but everything else had changed. Where Murphy's had been painted a warm yellow, the pharmacy was stark white. Where there had been a small parking lot, there was now a landscaped area with modern benches. I went inside, hoping to find someone who could tell me about the previous business. "Excuse me," I said to the pharmacist, a woman in her 40s with greying hair. "I'm new to the area, and I was wondering what used to be in this building before the pharmacy." She looked puzzled. "This has always been Riverside Pharmacy. My family has owned this location for 12 years. No other business before that. Well, my husband's father ran it before us, but it's been a pharmacy for at least 20 years. Maybe longer. We have records going back to 1998. I thanked her and left, my hands shaking slightly as I made notes. In my notebook, I wrote down everything I could remember about Murphy's Diner. The layout, the menu, the colour of the booths, the way Murphy always hummed while he cooked. The pattern continued throughout the afternoon. The barber shop I remembered had been replaced by a coffee shop that looked like it had been there for years. A vacant lot where I was sure there had been a small apartment building now contained a well-established community garden with mature plants. Most disturbing, the people I talked to didn't just disagree with my memories. They seemed genuinely confused by my questions, as if I was asking about places that had never existed. By late afternoon, I had documented 7 significant discrepancies between what I remembered and what currently existed. In each case, the current version looked authentic and established, not like recent changes or replacements. I decided to try a different approach. There was a used bookstore on Oak Street that specialised in local history and ephemera. If changes had been made to the neighbourhood, there might be some record of what had been there before. Paperback Paradise was exactly as I remembered it. Dusty, cramped, with towers of books reaching toward the ceiling, and narrow aisles that barely allowed one person to pass. The owner, an elderly woman named Mrs. Henderson, was sorting through a box of old magazines behind the counter. "I'm looking for anything about the University District," I told her. "Old photos, newspapers, anything that might show what the neighbourhood looked like in the past few years. Any particular time period? Actually, I'm most interested in very recent history, like 2019 to now. I'm trying to track some changes in the area." She directed me to a section near the back where she kept local newspapers and university publications. I spent an hour going through issues of the student newspaper, looking for any mention of Murphy's Diner, Warren Street, or the other places I remembered. In a stack of community newsletters from 2020, I found something that made my pulse quicken. There was a small classified ad that read, "Murphy's Diner closing after 15 years. Thanks to all our loyal customers. Final day, March 15th, 2020. I stared at the ad, reading it over and over. Here was proof that Murphy's Diner had existed, that I wasn't imagining things. I looked around for Mrs. Henderson to ask about purchasing the newsletter, but she'd stepped away from the counter. While I waited for her to return, I continued searching through the papers. In a university newsletter from 2019, I found a small article about a community art project that mentioned the Warren Street Mural Renovation Project. The article was brief, but it clearly referred to Warren Street as a real place. I gathered both publications and brought them to the counter, but Mrs. Henderson was still nowhere to be seen. After waiting for several minutes, I heard voices coming from the back room. Mrs. Henderson talking to someone in low, urgent tones. "I'll be right with you," she called out. But something about her tone had changed. When she emerged from the back room a few minutes later, she looked flustered and avoided making eye contact. "I'm sorry, but we're closing early today," she said. "Family emergency." "I just wanted to buy these 2 newsletters," I said, holding up the publications with the Murphy's Diner ad and the Warren Street reference. She glanced at the papers in my hand and her expression became even more uncomfortable. "I'm sorry, but those items aren't for sale. They're part of a private collection that was brought in by mistake." "But they were in the public section." "Please leave," she said firmly. "We're closed." I had no choice but to put the newsletters back and leave the store. As I walked to my car, I noticed a dark sedan parked across the street with 2 people inside. The passenger seemed to be watching the bookstore. I drove around the block and parked where I could observe paperback paradise without being obvious about it. Within 10 minutes, I saw Mrs. Henderson lock up the store and flip the sign to closed. The dark sedan pulled away from the curb and followed her as she walked to her own car. That night I tried calling the bookstore. The phone rang and rang, but nobody answered. When I drove by the next afternoon, there was a sign in the window. "Closed due to illness. Reopening date TBD." I never saw those newsletters again. And when the store reopened 2 weeks later, Mrs. Henderson claimed to have no memory of our conversation about local history publications. But I had seen them. The Murphy's Diner ad and the Warren Street reference had been real, printed in black and white. Someone was making sure that evidence of the old neighbourhood disappeared as quickly as I found it. That night, I started taking precautions. I made copies of everything I wrote in my notebook and hid them in different locations around my apartment. If my written records could somehow be altered like the maps had been, I wanted to make sure I had backups. I also started taking photos of everything. Street signs, buildings, murals, storefronts. If reality was being edited somehow, maybe photographs would provide a more permanent record. I had no idea how naive that hope was. After the incident at Paperback Paradise, I realised I needed to be more careful about how I investigated the changes in the neighbourhood. If someone was monitoring people who asked too many questions about Warren Street, I couldn't just walk around interviewing random strangers. Instead, I decided to focus my search online. The internet was vast and decentralised. Surely it would be harder to scrub every reference to places and events that had apparently been erased from physical reality. I started with basic searches: Warren Street University District, Murphy's Diner, street name changes. Most of the results were irrelevant, but I found a few forum posts and social media comments that seemed promising. However, when I tried to access them, I kept getting page not found errors, or finding that the posts had been deleted. It was frustrating, but I kept trying different search terms and looking deeper into cached results. After several hours of this tedious work, I found something interesting. Buried in the comments section of a paranormal blog was a cryptic post from someone with the username Reality Archivist. For those experiencing geographical discontinuities, timeline displacement, or collective memory revision events, there is a place to document and discuss these phenomena safely. Search for Forgotten Archive on Tor. Use standard precautions. I had heard of Tor, the anonymizing browser used to access hidden parts of the internet. I had never needed it before, but the idea of geographical discontinuities was too close to my own experience to ignore. It took me a few hours to figure out how to install and configure Tor properly, and another hour to find the Forgotten Archive forum. When I finally accessed it, I found a simple, text-based discussion board with several dozen active threads. The forum's description read, "A space for documenting and discussing places, events, and people that no longer exist. Share your memories, compare experiences, and preserve what has been forgotten. Anonymity required. Verification encouraged." I spent the next several hours reading through posts, and what I found there was both reassuring and terrifying. There were dozens of people from around the world reporting experiences similar to mine. A woman in Portland described how her neighbourhood pizza place had been replaced by a bank, with everyone insisting the bank had always been there. A man in Chicago wrote about a park that had somehow become a shopping centre overnight, complete with businesses that had apparently been operating there for years. But the post that really caught my attention was from someone called Phase Walker. Phoenix residents. Has anyone noticed changes in the Midtown district? Specifically, I'm looking for anyone who remembers Central Avenue, between 7th and 15th Streets, being completely different last month. Buildings are the same height and general style, but wrong colours, wrong businesses, wrong details. Also, does anyone remember the Morrison building having a different architectural style? The post had been made 3 weeks earlier and had several responses. People confirmed similar experiences in Phoenix, but what was most interesting were the details Phase Walker provided in follow-up comments. The changes happened all at once, sometime between Tuesday night and Wednesday morning. I noticed a bright flash in the sky around 3:30 a.m. Tuesday, followed by a low rumbling sound. By Wednesday, the entire 6-block area had these subtle but consistent differences. The pattern seems to be systematic, like someone ran a find and replace function on reality. Same overall structure, but with details swapped out for alternatives that look equally real and established. I've been tracking the phenomenon for 8 months now. It's happened 3 times in Phoenix, always preceded by the same atmospheric disturbance. Always between 3 and 4 a.m. Always affecting a specific geographic area in a grid pattern. I created an account with the username Night Driver and posted my own experience. University District, major metropolitan area, keeping location vague for now. Warren Street became Miller Avenue overnight. All records change to match new reality. Physical evidence disappears when discovered. People who remember the old version seem to attract attention from unknown parties. Anyone else experience active suppression of investigation? The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within an hour, I had a dozen replies from people who had experienced similar reality shifts. More importantly, 3 people had direct messages for me, including one from Phase Walker. Check your private messages, the forum's built-in system informed me. PMS are automatically encrypted and delete after 48 hours. Phase Walker's message was brief but specific. Your pattern matches Phoenix event number 3. Grid-based replacement, systematic documentation destruction, observer monitoring, need to talk. Same time tomorrow in encrypted chat room number 7734. The second message was from someone called Temporal Witness. If you're experiencing active suppression, you're past the point of casual observation. They know you remember. Be careful what you search for online from now on. The third was from Grid Theory. The University District changes you describe match predicted coordinates from the projection model. If you're willing to help with documentation, there may be a way to predict the next event. I spent the rest of the night reading everything I could find on the forum. The more I read, the more convinced I became that what I was experiencing wasn't unique or isolated. There was a pattern here, a systematic process of reality alteration that was affecting people around the world. The forum users had developed their own terminology and theories of reality shifts, sudden changes to physical locations that appeared to have always been that way, memory islands. People who retained memories of the pre-shift reality, evidence decay, the tendency for physical proof of old reality to disappear or be altered, grid events, reality shifts that followed systematic patterns across urban areas, adjustment teams, mysterious groups that seemed to monitor and suppress investigation. The most disturbing thread was titled Disappeared Observers. It contained reports of people who had been actively investigating reality shifts and had subsequently vanished entirely. In some cases, family members and friends claimed no memory of the missing person ever existing. One post from Archive Keeper read, "Toronto Mapper has been offline for 3 weeks. Checked with contacts in the city. No record of anyone by his real name at his last known address. Employer claims no one by that name ever worked there. His entire identity appears to have been edited out of the system." I closed the laptop and sat in my dark living room trying to process what I had learned. If the forum users were right, I wasn't just dealing with some local phenomenon or personal delusion. I was apparently part of a global pattern of reality manipulation that someone was going to great lengths to hide. And if the forum was correct about adjustment teams and people who asked too many questions, I was already in more danger than I had realised. The next evening I logged into encrypted chat room number 7734 to meet Phase Walker. What I learned there would change everything I thought I knew about the nature of reality itself. The encrypted chat with Phasewalker was scheduled for 11 p.m, but I logged in an hour early to get familiar with the interface. The chat room was completely anonymous. No usernames displayed, just randomised ID numbers that changed every few minutes. At exactly 11 p.m, a message appeared. Night Driver, confirm you're here by describing the colour of the building that's wrong on your Miller Avenue. I typed back, Sage Green Corner building, should be terracotta. Confirmed. I'm the Phoenix contact. Before we start, have you noticed anyone watching you since you began investigating? I thought about the man by the lamppost outside Miller Avenue, and the sedan that had followed Mrs. Henderson from the bookstore. Maybe a few incidents that seemed like surveillance. Then we need to cover safety protocols first. Are you posting from your home? Yes. Bad idea. From now on, only access the forum and chats from public Wi-Fi, preferably locations you can leave quickly. Never the same place twice. Assume your home internet is monitored if you've been flagged as an observer. This was getting into territory that felt paranoid, but given everything I had experienced, I decided to take the advice seriously. Flagged by who? We call them adjustment teams, but we don't know exactly who they work for. Government black project, private corporation, something else. The source doesn't matter as much as the pattern. They monitor for people who remember pre-shift reality and document evidence. At first they just clean up loose ends, remove evidence, discredit witnesses. But if someone digs too deep or becomes too vocal, they escalate. Escalate how? Depends. Sometimes the person just stops investigating, gets distracted by sudden life changes, new job opportunities, family emergencies. Sometimes they disappear from forums and can't be reached. In extreme cases, they disappear entirely. Identity scrubbed from records. Family and friends lose all memory of them. The implications of that made me feel sick. You're saying they can edit people out of existence? We think so. Same process that changes street names and building colours, just applied to human beings instead of places. But here's what's important. We've never lost anyone who followed proper security protocols and worked within our support network. Phasewalker spent the next hour teaching me basic operational security. Use public Wi-Fi exclusively for forum access. Never search for shift-related terms on personal devices or networks. Vary my travel patterns and avoid predictable routines. Most importantly, document everything offline and in multiple hidden locations. The documentation is crucial, Phasewalker explained. They can alter physical evidence, but they seem to have trouble with distributed, redundant records. If you hide copies of your notes in 10 different places, they might find and alter some of them, but usually not all. Finally, we got to the technical discussion of what we were actually dealing with. The working theory is that we're experiencing timeline convergence events, Phasewalker wrote. Imagine two almost identical realities running parallel to each other. Same basic structure, same historical events, but small differences in details, street names, building colours, business locations, individual faces. You're saying there are multiple versions of reality? Multiple versions, yes, but usually kept separate by what physicists call quantum decoherence. Think of it like radio stations. They exist simultaneously, but you can only tune into one at a time. Something is causing these reality streams to merge, with one version overwriting the other. What could cause something like that? High-energy particle experiments, electromagnetic anomalies, possibly even certain astronomical events. The forum has been tracking correlations between shifts and activities at research facilities, but the data is incomplete. Phasewalker sent me a file containing maps and timelines of documented reality shifts from around the world. The patterns were striking, events clustered around major universities and research facilities, with timing that suggested coordination or a spreading effect. Phoenix has a major particle physics lab 30 miles south of the city, Phasewalker noted. Every shift event here has occurred within 72 hours of high-energy experiments. Your university district, any major research facilities nearby? I thought about it. The university had a physics department, but I didn't know about major experimental work. However, about 20 miles northwest of the city was Brookhaven Research Institute, a private facility that did contract work for the government. Possibly, I'll need to research it. Be careful how you research it. Don't use normal search engines or library computers. The adjustment teams monitor for certain types of inquiries. We agreed to meet again in 3 days, same time, same protocol. Phasewalker gave me a list of specific things to document: any unusual atmospheric phenomena, timing of changes, geographic patterns, and especially any signs of surveillance. One more thing, Phasewalker added before signing off. If you see a bright flash in the sky followed by low-frequency rumbling, that's the signature of an active shift event. You'll have maybe 6 hours before the changes lock in. That's your window to document everything you can about the pre-shift reality. The next day, I implemented the new security protocols. I found a different coffee shop with public Wi-Fi and spent an hour researching Brookhaven Research Institute. What I found was concerning. Brookhaven specialised in advanced particle physics research with applications for national security. Their website was deliberately vague, but academic papers referenced work on quantum field manipulation and dimensional interface studies. Most significantly, their experimental schedule showed high-energy runs every Tuesday and Friday night between 2 and 5 a.m. Warren Street had become Miller Avenue on a Wednesday morning. The last high-energy run at Brookhaven had been Tuesday night, 2 to 5 a.m. I started paying attention to details I'd previously ignored. On Friday afternoon, I positioned myself in the Miller Avenue area with my notebook and camera, planning to monitor the area through the night. At 11 p.m. I noticed the first watcher. He was sitting in a car parked at the far end of the street, positioned to have a clear view of the entire block. Middle-aged, wearing dark clothes, professional demeanour. He wasn't trying to hide his presence, but he wasn't obvious about surveillance either. At midnight, a second watcher appeared on foot, casually strolling through the area but lingering near streetlights and stopping frequently to check his phone. At 1 a.m, a van with tinted windows parked near the corner intersection. By 2 a.m, there were at least 5 people in the area who seemed to be conducting some kind of coordinated observation. They weren't focused on me specifically. They seemed to be monitoring the entire neighbourhood. At 3:17 a.m, I saw the flash. It started as a bright point of light in the northwestern sky, roughly in the direction of Brookhaven Research Institute. The light expanded rapidly, not like an explosion, but more like a ripple spreading across the sky. For about 3 seconds, the entire northwestern horizon was illuminated with an eerie blue-white glow. Then came the sound, a deep thrumming rumble that seemed to come from underground rather than the sky. It was felt as much as heard, a vibration that made car alarms start going off throughout the neighbourhood. The watchers immediately became more active. I saw them talking into radios and checking devices that looked more sophisticated than cell phones. The van started its engine. I spent the next hour documenting everything I could see in the area, taking photos and writing detailed descriptions. At first, nothing seemed different, but around 5 a.m, I noticed subtle changes beginning to appear. The streetlight on the corner flickered and went out. When it came back on a few minutes later, it was a different style, same height and position, but with a more modern LED fixture instead of the old sodium vapour lamp. The stop sign at the intersection looked slightly different. The red was a shade deeper, and the reflective strips were positioned differently. Most unsettling, when I looked back at photos I'd taken just 2 hours earlier, some of them showed these new versions instead of what I remembered photographing. By dawn, the watchers had disappeared. I drove home, my hands shaking as I realised I had just witnessed a reality shift in progress. That afternoon, I returned to Miller Avenue to document the full extent of the changes. The differences were subtle but consistent. Paint colours slightly different, business signs in new fonts, even the memorial plaque in the park had been altered. The dedication date was now 2011 instead of 2009, and it honoured the Miller Avenue Heritage Preservation Society instead of the Community Garden Group. Most disturbing of all, when I tried to access the photos I had taken during the night, half of them had been automatically corrected by my phone software to match the new reality. My camera had somehow been convinced that it had always photographed the updated version of the neighbourhood. But my handwritten notes remained unchanged. Whatever technology was altering physical evidence couldn't seem to affect ink on paper, at least not immediately. I spent the rest of the week implementing additional security measures and preparing for my next meeting with Phasewalker. I made multiple copies of my notes and hid them in different locations around the city. I bought a second phone that I kept turned off except for emergencies. Most importantly, I started paying attention to my daily routine and varying it randomly. It was a good thing I did. On Wednesday morning, I noticed a car that had been parked outside my apartment building for 3 days straight. Different cars, different people, but always someone maintaining visual surveillance of the building entrance. On Thursday, I received a phone call from someone claiming to be conducting a survey about community memory and local history. The questions were oddly specific about Warren Street and recent changes in the university district. On Friday, I found that my apartment had been searched while I was out. Nothing was missing, but small things had been moved. Books in slightly different positions, papers shuffled, furniture shifted by inches. It was done professionally by someone who wanted me to know they had been there without making it obvious to anyone else. The message was clear. They knew who I was, where I lived, and what I was investigating. That night I packed a bag and left my apartment. I didn't know if or when I would be able to return safely. I spent the next week staying in cheap motels and internet cafes, using different locations each day to access the Forgotten Archive forum. The pattern of surveillance had made it clear that my investigation had moved beyond casual interest. I was now actively being monitored by whoever was behind the reality shifts. Phasewalker had warned me this might happen. Our next scheduled meeting was in encrypted chat room number 7734, but given the escalation in attention, I needed to be extra careful about operational security. I chose a 24-hour internet cafe in a different part of the city, paid cash, and used a computer terminal in the back corner where I could see anyone approaching. At exactly 11 p.m, I logged into the chat room. Phasewalker was already waiting. Night driver, confirm status. Are you still operating freely? Apartment compromised. Living mobile for now. Witnessed active shift event Tuesday night. Documentation successful, but photos were retroactively altered. Confirmed pattern. They're escalating because you're documenting real-time changes. That makes you a priority target, but it also means you've seen something very few people have witnessed directly. I described the flash in the sky, the rumbling sound, and the gradual transformation of the neighbourhood over the following hours. Phasewalker seemed particularly interested in the timing and the electromagnetic effects. The 6-hour lag between the flash and full manifestation is consistent with other observations, Phasewalker typed. We think that's how long it takes for the quantum decoherence field to fully stabilise. During those 6 hours, reality is basically in flux. Some people see the old version, some see the new, some see both overlapping. What about the retroactive changes to photographs? Quantum field effects can alter magnetic storage and digital memory. That's why we rely on handwritten documentation, and physical photographs when possible. The analogue formats seem more resistant to alteration. Phasewalker sent me a file that made my skin crawl. It was a detailed map of my city with a grid overlay, marking predicted locations for future reality shifts. We've been tracking the pattern for 8 months now, Phasewalker explained. The shifts aren't random. They follow a systematic grid pattern radiating outward from specific central points, usually research facilities or locations with unusual electromagnetic properties. The map showed Brookhaven Research Institute at the centre of concentric circles, with predicted shift zones marked at regular intervals. The university district where I had witnessed the Warren Street change was in the second ring. According to the projection, the next affected area would be the downtown financial district, approximately 3 miles southeast of Brookhaven. When? I typed. If the pattern holds, next Tuesday night. The high-energy experiments at Brookhaven run on a regular schedule, and each cycle seems to push the effect field a little further outward. I studied the map more carefully. The grid was precise, almost mechanical in its layout. Each shift zone was approximately the same size, roughly 6 city blocks in a square pattern. Within each zone, the changes appeared to follow consistent rules. Same basic infrastructure, but with details altered in systematic ways. This looks like a spreading wave pattern, I observed. Exactly. Like ripples in a pond, but moving through dimensional space instead of water. Each experimental cycle at Brookhaven creates another pulse, and each pulse pushes the effect boundary a little further out. Walker sent me additional files, documentation from other cities where similar patterns had been observed. Phoenix, Seattle, Austin, Atlanta, all had research facilities at the centre of expanding grids of reality shifts. Is this coordinated? Are all these facilities working together? We don't know. Could be coordinated, could be that multiple groups are working on similar technology and creating interference patterns. What we do know is that it's accelerating. The time between shift events is getting shorter, and the affected areas are getting larger. The implications were staggering. If the pattern continued, eventually the entire metropolitan area would be affected. Millions of people would wake up one day in a slightly different version of their own city, with most of them never realising anything had changed. Why don't more people notice? I asked. Most people don't pay attention to small details. If your street sign changes colour or a building gets painted a different shade, do you really notice? Even if you do, you assume there's a mundane explanation, routine maintenance, normal updates. The human brain is remarkably good at rationalising small inconsistencies. But some people do notice. About 1 in 1,000, based on our estimates. Usually people with strong observational skills or particular attention to detail. Night shift workers see it more often, probably because they're more aware of their environment during quiet hours. Walker sent me detailed instructions for documenting the predicted shift in the financial district. The key was to be in position before the experimental window, document the pre-shift state thoroughly, then track changes in real time during the 6-hour transformation period. This is dangerous, Walker warned. If you're caught in an active shift zone during the transition, there can be complications. What kind of complications? People have reported disorientation, memory confusion, in extreme cases temporary existence in both realities simultaneously. One observer in Seattle claimed to spend 3 hours in a version of the city where she had never been born. She could see her apartment, but strangers were living there, and no one recognised her name. I closed my eyes, trying to imagine what that would feel like, being erased from your own life, even temporarily. There's something else, Walker continued. The Forum has been tracking missing persons reports in areas that have experienced multiple shift events. The numbers are statistically significant. People don't just disappear from records, they disappear from reality entirely. How many people? Hard to get exact numbers because of the nature of the disappearances, but we estimate between 50 and 100 people nationwide over the past year. All of them were either active observers or people who had been asking questions about reality shifts. I thought about the disappeared observers thread on the forum and the reports of people who had simply stopped existing. If Walker was right, I was not just investigating a strange phenomenon, I was documenting what amounted to a systematic alteration of reality that was claiming human casualties. Why are you telling me this? Wouldn't it be safer for me to just stop investigating? Because stopping doesn't seem to protect people once they've been flagged, and because we need documentation of real-time shifts if we're ever going to understand how to stop this process. Stop it? You think it can be stopped? We have to believe it can be, because if it can't, eventually there won't be anyone left who remembers what the world was supposed to look like. We arranged to meet again after the predicted financial district shift. Walker would monitor from Phoenix while I documented locally, and we would compare observations to refine the prediction model. Before signing off, Walker gave me one final piece of advice. If you're going to do this, you need to accept that you might not be able to return to your normal life. Once you've seen reality change in real time, once you've documented evidence of systematic alteration, you become part of a very small group of people who know what's really happening. That knowledge comes with a price. I logged off and sat in the internet cafe for a long time, staring at the map of predicted shift zones. My apartment was in the 5th ring out from Brookhaven. If the pattern continued, my own neighbourhood would be affected within a few months. I could try to return to my normal life, pretend I'd never noticed anything unusual, hope that ignorance would protect me. But I had already seen too much, asked too many questions, attracted too much attention, and somewhere in the back of my mind a terrible thought was forming. What if this had happened before? What if the reality I thought of as normal was actually the result of previous shift events, and I was just now becoming aware of an ongoing process that had been altering the world for years? What if the life I remembered was already gone, and I was just a memory island floating in someone else's version of reality? The financial district shift was scheduled for Tuesday night, but on Monday afternoon I received an encrypted message through the forum's private messaging system. It wasn't from Phase Walker. The sender was identified as Dr_Cassandra_Mills, with a verification code I didn't recognise. Night Driver, I know you don't know me, but I've been following your documentation work through mutual contacts. I have information about the source of the reality shifts that could help your investigation. If you're willing to meet in person, I can explain what's really happening and why. I understand the risks of face-to-face contact, but some things can't be communicated safely through digital channels. The message included detailed instructions for a meeting location, a 24-hour diner in an industrial area about 15 miles from downtown, and specific security protocols. The sender claimed to be a former researcher at Brookhaven Institute who had left the project after discovering the true scope of what they were attempting. Every instinct told me this was dangerous. Phase Walker had warned me about trusting unknown contacts, and meeting someone in person violated every security protocol I had learned. But the possibility of getting inside information about Brookhaven was too valuable to ignore. I spent Monday night researching the meeting location and planning multiple escape routes. The diner was isolated but had good visibility in all directions. There were several ways to approach and leave the area without being trapped. Most importantly, it was far enough from Brookhaven that it shouldn't be affected by Tuesday night's predicted shift event. At 2 a.m. Tuesday morning, I drove to the meeting location. The diner was exactly as described, a classic 1950s-style establishment that looked like it catered to truck drivers and late-shift workers. I arrived 30 minutes early and positioned myself at a corner booth where I could watch both the entrance and the parking lot. At exactly 2:30 a.m, a woman in her 40s entered the diner. She was tall, with greying brown hair and the kind of intense, intelligent eyes that suggested an academic background. She looked around the restaurant carefully before approaching my table. "You must be the rideshare driver," she said quietly. "I'm Cassandra Mills. Thank you for coming." She sat across from me and immediately began speaking in low, urgent tones. "I need to start by telling you that everything you've observed is real, but it's not what you think it is. The reality shifts aren't accidental side effects of particle physics experiments. They're the entire point of the project." "What do you mean?" "Brookhaven Institute isn't conducting pure research. They're working on a contract for a consortium of government agencies and private organisations. The goal is to develop technology for what they call reality optimization." The phrase sent a chill down my spine. Reality optimization? Think of it as editing history on a small scale. Imagine being able to change inconvenient facts, remove evidence of mistakes, alter public memory of events. The applications for intelligence agencies and corporations are obvious. She pulled out a tablet and showed me documents that looked like technical specifications and project timelines. I couldn't verify their authenticity, but the level of detail was impressive. "The technology works by manipulating quantum decoherence fields," she explained. "In simple terms, we're forcing reality to choose between multiple possible versions of the same location or event. The version that gets selected depends on parameters we input into the quantum field generator." "You're saying this is deliberate?" "Someone is choosing what changes." "Exactly. Each experimental run at Brookhaven isn't testing the technology, it's implementing specific changes requested by clients. Warren Street became Miller Avenue because someone wanted that change made. But why? What's the point of changing a random street name? It's not random. Every change serves a purpose, usually to alter or obscure some piece of evidence or memory. Maybe there was a crime on Warren Street that someone wanted forgotten. Maybe a business or political deal that needed to be erased from public record. The street name change forces all the associated records and memories to be updated." She showed me more documents, project files with client codes and change specifications. I saw references to memory revision protocols and evidence nullification procedures. "The process has limitations," Cassandra continued. "It can only alter small areas at a time, and it works best on details that people don't pay close attention to. But the technology is improving rapidly. Early tests could only change things like paint colours and sign fonts. Now they can alter entire buildings and create false histories going back decades. What about the people who remember the original versions? Most people's memories are automatically adjusted along with the physical changes, but about 1 in 1,000 individuals seem to be resistant to the memory revision effect. You're what we call a persistent observer, someone whose brain maintains quantum coherence at a level that resists the alteration field. And that's why I'm being watched. Persistent observers are a problem for the project. If too many people notice the changes and start comparing notes, it could expose the entire operation. So there are protocols for dealing with observers: surveillance, evidence removal, and if necessary, more direct intervention. Direct intervention? Cassandra's expression became grim. The same technology that can edit buildings out of reality can be applied to people. Remove someone from the quantum field entirely, and it's as if they never existed. No body, no crime scene, no investigation, because no one remembers there was ever a person to disappear. The implications hit me like a physical blow. How many people? I don't have exact numbers, but I know it's been used at least a dozen times since the project became operational, always on persistent observers who are getting too close to the truth. Why are you telling me this? Why risk meeting me? Because I helped design this technology, and I need to live with what it's being used for. When I agreed to work on quantum field manipulation, I thought we were developing tools for scientific research. I didn't know it would be used to erase people from existence. She handed me a small device that looked like a modified smartphone. This is a quantum field detector. It can sense reality distortions up to 6 hours before they manifest. It will also alert you if you're being targeted for direct intervention. Targeted how? If someone initiates an erasure protocol on you, the device will give you approximately 30 minutes warning. That's how long it takes to calibrate the field for a specific target. It might be enough time to get out of range. Out of range of what? The erasure field has a limited radius, about 2 miles from the generation source. If you can get outside that perimeter before the protocol completes, you should be safe. I looked at the device, trying to understand what she was telling me. You're saying if I stay more than 2 miles away from Brookhaven, they can't erase me? From the main facility, yes, but they have mobile units for field work, smaller generators that can be deployed anywhere, with a range of about half a mile. How do I know if a mobile unit is targeting me? The detector will show you the direction and approximate distance to any active quantum field source. If you see a mobile signature approaching your location, you need to move immediately. Cassandra glanced at her watch. I have to go. The financial district shift is scheduled to begin in 4 hours, and I need to be somewhere with an alibi when it happens. Wait, you said each change serves a specific purpose. What's being hidden in the financial district? I don't know the details, but the client code suggests it's related to banking records, probably erasing evidence of some financial irregularity or illegal transaction. After tonight, certain buildings, businesses, or records will no longer exist, and no one will remember they ever did. She stood up to leave, then turned back one more time. One more thing. The project is expanding rapidly. The current schedule has shift events planned for 3 more cities this month, and the frequency is increasing. They're not just hiding individual crimes or mistakes anymore. I think they're preparing for something much larger. Like what? Like editing recent history on a massive scale. Think about what you could accomplish if you could make entire events disappear from public memory. Elections, scandals, wars, anything that someone wanted to undo. After she left, I sat in the diner for another hour, trying to process what I had learned. If Cassandra was telling the truth, I wasn't just investigating a strange phenomenon, I was documenting a secret war against reality itself. The quantum field detector remained silent until I started driving back toward the city. Then, at 6:47 a.m., it began beeping softly. I looked at the display and saw a distance reading. 2.3 miles, decreasing. A mobile unit was approaching my location. I pressed the accelerator and drove as fast as I dared, watching the distance reading gradually increase as I put space between myself and whatever was hunting me. The device didn't stop beeping until I was more than 5 miles away from the city centre. For the first time since this all began, I understood exactly how much danger I was in. The quantum field detector that Cassandra had given me became my constant companion over the next 3 days. It remained mostly quiet, but twice I had to quickly change locations when it detected mobile field sources approaching. The cat and mouse game was exhausting, but it also gave me valuable information about how the erasure teams operated. They seemed to work in predictable patterns, sweeping through areas where I had been seen, checking locations where I might seek shelter. More importantly, they appeared to have limitations. The mobile units couldn't maintain their quantum fields indefinitely, and they needed several hours to recharge between deployment attempts. I used this window to document the financial district shift from a safe distance. Just as Phase Walker had predicted, the event occurred at 3:33 a.m. on Tuesday night. I watched from a parking garage 4 miles away as the familiar blue-white flash illuminated the sky, followed by the deep rumbling that seemed to come from underground. Over the next 6 hours, I used telephoto lenses to observe the gradual transformation of the downtown area. Buildings shifted colour, signs changed fonts, and at least one entire block seemed to be restructured with different architectural styles. By dawn, the financial district looked subtly but comprehensively different. More disturbing, when I checked news websites and social media the next day, I found reports of a minor earthquake that had supposedly occurred at the same time as the flash. Seismologists were quoted as saying it was a rare but harmless tectonic adjustment. The official narrative was already being established to explain away what people had observed. On Thursday afternoon, the quantum field detector started behaving erratically. Instead of the steady readings I had grown accustomed to, it began showing multiple field sources scattered throughout the city. The display looked like a radar screen during a storm, dozens of mobile signals moving in coordinated patterns. I realised they weren't hunting me individually anymore. They were conducting a systematic sweep of the entire metropolitan area. That evening I received one final message through the forum's encrypted system. It was from Phase Walker. Major escalation detected in multiple cities. Grid pattern acceleration confirmed. They're moving to Phase 2. Final convergence predicted for your location. Saturday night, 3:33 a.m. This is not a normal shift event. Recommend immediate evacuation beyond 50-mile radius. I tried to respond, but the forum was no longer accessible. When I attempted to reach any of the Forgotten Archive servers, I received only error messages. It was as if the entire network had been taken offline. The quantum field detector showed the reason why. Field sources were now active at locations throughout the city, including several positions that surrounded the internet cafe, where I was trying to access the forum. They weren't just hunting persistent observers anymore, they were systematically suppressing all communication channels that could be used to coordinate resistance. I spent Thursday night driving aimlessly through the outer suburbs, staying ahead of the mobile units while trying to understand what final convergence might mean. The detector showed an increasingly dense network of field sources, all of them moving in perfect coordination towards some kind of centralized pattern. By Friday morning I understood what they were planning. Instead of the usual isolated shift affecting a few city blocks, they were preparing to alter the entire metropolitan area simultaneously. Every mobile unit, every field generator, every piece of quantum manipulation technology they had was being positioned for a coordinated reality revision on a scale I had never imagined possible. But what were they trying to hide that would require editing an entire city? The answer came to me while I was studying a map of the field source positions. The pattern wasn't random. The mobile units were positioned at specific locations throughout the city, locations that corresponded to government buildings, research facilities, major corporate headquarters, and media centres. They weren't hiding evidence of individual crimes. They were preparing to erase something that had left traces throughout the entire power structure of the city. Something big enough that removing all evidence of it required changing the reality of 3 million people simultaneously. Friday night, I positioned myself on a hilltop 20 miles outside the city limits, well beyond the range of any quantum field technology I knew about. The detector showed the massive build-up of field sources throughout the metropolitan area, all synchronized for simultaneous activation. At exactly 3:33 a.m. on Saturday, the sky above the city exploded with light. It wasn't the localized flash I had seen during previous shift events. the entire horizon lit up with brilliant blue-white radiance that lasted for nearly 30 seconds. The rumbling that followed was so intense I could feel it through the ground, even at my distance. Then, as I watched through binoculars, the city began to change. Not gradually as I had observed before, but rapidly and comprehensively. Buildings flickered between different versions of themselves. Entire blocks shifted layout and architectural style. The skyline itself was being rewritten in real time, but something went wrong. About 10 minutes into the process, the light began to flicker irregularly. The smooth transformation became chaotic, with buildings and streets oscillating between multiple possible versions. The quantum field detector was screaming with alarms as it registered massive instabilities in the reality distortion grid. Through my binoculars, I could see people in the streets, wandering in obvious confusion. Some appeared to be experiencing multiple overlapping realities simultaneously, stopping and starting as they navigated spaces that were changing around them faster than their minds could process. At 4:15 a.m. there was a final blinding flash, followed by complete darkness. When my vision cleared, the city looked normal again, but not the same normal I remembered. The skyline was subtly different. Buildings I had known for years were gone, replaced by structures in completely different architectural styles. The highway system had been rerouted. Even the geographical features looked wrong. Hills in different positions, the river following a slightly altered course. I tried to use my phone to call someone, anyone, to see if they remembered the old version of the city. But when I checked my contacts list, it was empty. When I tried to dial my sister's number from memory, the recording said it had never been assigned. Worse, when I checked my driver's license, my own name was spelled differently. Not dramatically, just one letter changed, but enough to make me question my own identity. I drove back toward what used to be my neighbourhood, but the streets were laid out differently. Where my apartment building should have been, there was a small park with a memorial plaque dated 1987, dedicating the space to those lost in the Great Reconstruction. I found a motel and spent the next several hours trying to access any information about what the city had been like before the final convergence. Every internet search, every historical record, every photograph showed the new version, as if it had always existed. The quantum field detector had gone silent. When I examined it more closely, I realised it was no longer functional. The massive field convergence had apparently burned out its sensors. On Sunday morning, I drove to where Brookhaven Research Institute should have been. I found an empty field with a historical marker indicating that the land had been preserved as a natural habitat since 1962. There was no sign that any research facility had ever existed there. I tried calling the number Cassandra had given me for emergency contact. The line was disconnected. When I searched for any record of Dr. Cassandra Mills, I found nothing. No employment history, no academic publications, no evidence that she had ever existed. By Sunday evening, I realised the terrible scope of what had happened. They hadn't just hidden evidence of some scandal or crime. They had rewritten the entire history of the city, creating a version of reality where their project had never existed at all. It's been 6 months since the final convergence, and I've learned to navigate this version of the city that wears my home's face but doesn't quite fit. The streets have familiar names but wrong layouts. The landmarks exist in different locations. The people I thought I knew have different histories, different personalities, sometimes different faces entirely. I tried to return to work, but the rideshare company has no record of my employment. My bank account exists, but with a different balance and a transaction history I don't recognise. My apartment building exists, but strangers live in what used to be my unit, and the landlord insists no one by my name has ever rented there. I found a few other persistent observers, people who, like me, retained memories of the pre-convergence reality. We meet occasionally in carefully chosen locations, sharing stories and comparing notes about what used to be. But we're careful. Even in this edited reality, we suspect that asking too many questions about the old world might still attract unwanted attention. The Forgotten Archive forum is gone completely, not just offline, but removed from internet history as if it never existed. The search terms that used to lead to discussions of reality shifts, now produce only academic papers about memory disorders and psychological delusions. I've tried to document what I remember of the original reality, writing everything down in multiple notebooks that I hide in different locations. But sometimes, when I check on them, I find that my own handwriting has changed subtly. Words altered, details modified, as if the editing process is still ongoing even now. The quantum field detector sits on my desk, permanently dead. Sometimes I wonder if Cassandra Mills was real, or if she was just another persistent observer like me who got erased when they cleaned up the loose ends. Maybe our entire conversation was a dream, or a hallucination brought on by exposure to reality distortion fields. But I don't think so. I remember her face too clearly, remember the weight of the device when she handed it to me, remember the specific technical details she shared about the quantum field technology. I think she was real, and I think she sacrificed herself to give me a warning that I couldn't fully understand until it was too late. Yesterday I drove to the hilltop where I watched the final convergence. There's a scenic overlook there now, with a plaque commemorating the site as a natural viewing area preserved since 1923. But when I stood in the exact spot where I had witnessed the city being rewritten, I could swear I saw something that shouldn't have been there. For just a moment, in the corner of my vision, the skyline flickered. For less than a second, I saw the old version of the city, the buildings I remembered, the highway system I had driven for years, the landscape that matched my mental map of home. Then it was gone, and I was looking at this new version that everyone else believes has always been there. I don't know if what I saw was real or just my mind's desperate attempt to hold on to memories that are being systematically erased. But it gives me hope that somewhere, somehow, the original reality still exists. Maybe that's all I can do now, remember what was, and hope that memory itself is enough to keep the truth alive, even in a world that's been edited to deny it ever existed. I think Warren Street was just the first stitch to tear. Whatever world I came from, it's gone, and this one doesn't want me here. But I'm still here anyway, carrying the ghost of a reality that only a few dozen people remember. And as long as we remember, maybe it's not entirely lost. Maybe remembering is enough. Maybe remembering is all we have left.